Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today Great.com talks with Joanna Barron, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which is a registered charity, independent and non-partisan. They defend constitutional rights and freedoms of Canadians in the court of law and public opinion. So welcome to this podcast. And if you're new here, you definitely want to press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we're going to talk about the challenges to liberty and much more. So Joanna, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great.com today.
It's great to be here with you.
So I made a brief introduction, but how would you describe your foundation to someone that is not familiar with the work that you do?
So we're a legal charity, totally privately funded. We've been around for about 15 years, although I've only been in this role for 3 years. We are a nimble team of 5 people located across Canada. I'm in Toronto, but we have staff in Calgary, Vancouver, etc. And we are sort of a small but mighty foundation that is the David to the Canadian government's Goliath, and where the government takes action that infringes on constitutionally guaranteed liberties, we push back, often with litigation in the courts, which is sort of the front lines of liberty. So it's a very engaging and sometimes frustrating job in a country like Canada, where libertarians are kind of the minority, but I do think that it's necessary work and really benefits the public and individual liberties.
Got it. So do you have some examples where you feel like the government have removed too much liberty and you have been fighting back?
Yeah, certainly. So I think one case that is sort of the flagship case of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, in the sense that we've been involved in it for over 10 years and really emblematic of the work that we do, is a case called Camby surgeries. So it's a case that we brought in partnership on behalf of a large private surgical center in Vancouver that was operating for more than 15 years, but it actually was operating in a sense, quote unquote, illegally, because technically the Canadian government holds a total monopoly over the delivery of healthcare services. So the government turned around and decided to start enforcing those laws against this surgery center. We got involved in the litigation, and something that is shocking for even many Canadians to learn is that Canada is the only country in the world, and this includes countries like Cuba and China, communist countries, that has a total government monopoly on healthcare. So even if you wish to, if you need to get a medically necessary surgery and the public system can't accommodate you in time, your choices are either to wait and suffer or leave the country and go seek care abroad or in the United States. And we know that many Canadians, in fact, do that. And so our argument is that we have a constitutionally guaranteed right that's called the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And clearly, the government preventing an individual from taking their health into their own hands when they're suffering, whether it be from a knee replacement or hip replacement or cataract surgery, clearly is in violation of this right, and it can't be justified. So we've been in litigation for more than 10 years around that case. We suffered a loss at the trial court level, but we are appealing the decision, and we are really passionate about it because we think that if we can achieve this victory, it will really improve the state of healthcare delivery for every Canadian.
That is very interesting. It's I get a rebel feeling. So help me understand then, what is the difference between the work that you are doing as lawyers to compared to, let's say, if you were a political organization and you tried to change the political decisions?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think this is why I was drawn in my career to work for a not-for-profit in the law and not as a politician, for example. Because the difference between getting a judicial determination that a government action, policy, regulation is unconstitutional is that the change is permanent. Of course, governments can try and change things, but once a judge of the Supreme Court of Canada determines that a given policy violates the Constitution in Canada and in most other countries is thought of as the supreme law of the land. And so you're really carving out a boundary against which the government cannot act for all future generations. And so it's much more durable and permanent and distinct, as opposed to just acting as a politician, bringing in policies. We're talking about first principles of how a government can and cannot regulate its citizens. And so for me, it goes to the structure of liberty in the country, as opposed to, with, I guess the analogy would be if the Constitution is the structure of the house, the policies and things politicians do are like the furniture. You can move it around, move it in and out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So where in other places do you feel like the governments are acting in ways that are removing important liberty for the citizens?
Yeah, so I would say we are extraordinarily busy right now. We are the busiest that we've been, I think, in the history of the organization because of the many government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we agree that health measures and public safety measures are necessary. But there have been instances where, in our view, the government has gone too far, and we have to uphold certain standards of rational connection between infringements on liberty and what we would call necessity for public health. So I'll tell you briefly about two cases that we're actively involved in, and then I'll make some general comments. So first is a case where there's a church here in Toronto where I live that's a huge church. It's like a pavilion. It can hold almost 3,000 people. And the Ontario government brought in a rule in late November that caps religious gatherings at 10 people, no matter how big the facility. Now, obviously, if your church is in a small basement, that makes sense. But when you have a large pavilion, and this particular congregation was being very diligent, they had their sacrament wine in individually wrapped bags. They had social distancing and masking. And I'm not a religious person, but for members of this church, their ability to attend services in person was really fundamental to them. It was not something that was an optional thing. Going to Zoom church was not going to be a substitute. And there's a constitutionally protected right to freedom of religion. Once somebody says this is a religious practice that they think is necessary to their faith, we don't get to question that. So that's one case that we are involved in. And again, the question should be, can the church hold its services in a way that respects public health guidelines, not an arbitrary cap? The second case, we actually had a preliminary win in, and that is a case of a specialized gym about 45 minutes outside of Toronto that particularly caters to the differently abled community. So individuals with disabilities of various kinds that, as part of their rehabilitation program, have specialized fitness regimes. And this gym was subject to a blanket stay-at-home lockdown order in Ontario. The difficulty that we pointed out with this was that elite gyms catering to hockey players and Olympians are still allowed to proceed. So it seems very unfair that these individuals who have a very rudimentary need for these, physical rehabilitation programs would be unable to access their gyms. So we brought a motion basically barring the government from enforcing lockdown measures against this gym. And we actually got a call from the government late last Friday night saying, by the way, you should check the laws. There's an amendment in there you may be interested in. And indeed, they brought in an amendment to the law to allow gyms catering to the differently abled community to operate. So we took that as a big preliminary win. So those instances are certainly heartening, but I also will say more broadly that we know, and this is not just in Canada, this is in democracies and countries throughout time in history, that crises tend to bring about big power grabs. Government will expand its powers, they will expand its ability to change laws and policies without democratic accountability, under the guise of various forms of emergency powers. And there may be a time for that. I accept that there may be a time for swift action, but we have to be, first of all, it should be absolutely circumscribed. And second of all, there's also a tendency for, once the emergency has passed, for the government to surreptitiously just keep those additional powers. And so the Canadian Constitution Foundation will be very careful in assuring that any additional government emergency powers are promptly rolled back at the nearest opportunity.
Seems like very important work that you're doing to defend, the freedom of people, and that it should not be taken for granted. So how do you then, because these were two examples, but I guess there must be maybe hundreds of cases. Like, what is your process to decide where to get involved?
Well, we like to bet big. So we look at cases that, first of all, touch on a matter of first principle, a really fundamental matter of liberty. So, there are all kinds of smaller examples of intrusions on liberty, but obviously we're a small charity. We have limited resources, so we have to choose where we can make the biggest impact. So for example, in the healthcare case, as I say, this will lead to a freer country for every Canadian, whether or not they choose to participate in a private insurance scheme. If some portion of the population, the ones that, for example, were going to Mexico or the US to pay for treatment, we can keep that in the country, we can keep that in our economy, and also we can free up the queue for people who are unable to afford private care. So it will just level the playing field, insert an aspect of competition into our healthcare system, which we know in every other industry improves outcomes. So that is, in a country like Canada, that is a huge difference, but it's obviously not easy. It's incredibly controversial because public healthcare is an article of faith in Canada. And to be clear, we support strengthening universal public health care. We just think that there should also be a private option for those who seek it. So first of all, it's how big of an impact we can make. And second of all, we are representing, the Constitution gives individuals rights against the state. So we're interested in compelling stories. We're interested in stories that bring out the aspects of how the Constitution is not just an abstract document, but a living guarantee of rights that every Canadian should feel they have access to. So I'll mention one other case, just because it just makes for great storytelling, which is important. There was a gentleman who drove over the border of one Canadian province to another, from New Brunswick into Quebec, because it's known that alcohol prices are quite a bit lower in Quebec. So he drove maybe half an hour over the border, bought a few cases of beer, some wine, whatever, drove back and was arrested by the New Brunswick police in a sort of sting operation and hit with a $700 fine just for buying some beer. Now, what does this have to do with the Constitution? We found that there's a provision of the Canadian Constitution that guarantees essentially free trade within the country. And so that would seem to bar imposing any type of duties for inter-provincial trade. And we took that all the way to the Supreme Court. And so it's an important case. It goes to a provision of our Constitution, that it was also a story that every Canadian could look at and say, hey, that could have been me. I would have driven over the border to buy some beer and save $50. That is just fundamentally not fair.
It's cool that when you win a case like that, you can change the law for everyone. And even like if the politicians change, like you mentioned, the law will still be in place there. So what do you kind of hope to accomplish? And also, what would you dream of happening in the next 5 to 10 years?
I would like to see a culture that is shifted towards liberty, where people understand that we're in control of our own destinies, that people should have the right to engage in the marketplace, both the marketplace economically and also the marketplace of ideas, that we cannot take our liberties for granted, and that really we should take more power into our hands as individuals and delegate less to the government. I think Canada is the greatest country in the world, and the only thing that could make it greater is by making it a freer country to live and build a family and build a business in.
Well said. So, what can someone do as an individual then? Because regardless if you live in Canada or if you live in my country, Stockholm, or someplace else, what can someone do to make sure that we keep our liberty and our freedom?
I would say just be vigilant. There is a worldwide freedom movement that the CCF is proudly part of, and we all work together in conferences and through, global alliances, and we share best practices with each other, and we see the same tendency of statist versus libertarians pops up across the developed world. So first of all, know that this network is available to you. And second of all, if you are subject to a state action that strikes you as arbitrary or unfair, speak up, find your local pro-liberty think tank, because if they're anything like the CCF, they're always actively seeking stories and cases from individuals, and they might just take your litigation on behalf of you. In terms of the CCF, we have active petitions right now. One that opposes the Canadian government's new quarantine prison hotels mandate to force travelers into hotels for 3 days for $2,000, one against arbitrary lockdowns. So there are real mechanisms to making your voice heard.
Beautiful. Well, Joanna, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great today. I feel like I learned a lot. I haven't heard before of such a small and nimble organization, like you mentioned, that can take on, work with individual stories, but in a way that creates lasting change. So it was very interesting to hear about this unique approach to changing policies.
It was great to chat with you, Emil.
Thank you. And for you listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that is showing the algorithms that this is important. So more people can hear this and start thinking about, what can I do to defend my freedom as an individual? Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. What is Great.com? That is the most common question that we get. And the shortest answer I can give you is that we are a company that is moving money from the online casino industry and donates it to charities that is helping the environment. The long answer, unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you today. But if you're curious, definitely Google what is Great.com to learn more.